Okay, let's get started. My name is Michael Vandenbergh, and I'm a professor here at Vanderbilt Law School. We have a great audience here in the room. We also are doing this as a webinar, so if you notice that we're trying to use microphones as much as possible, it's not because we don't think people in the room can hear. It's because we have an audience around the U.S. and maybe around the world. I haven't checked that yet. But welcome. This is the implications of the universal owner for climate mitigation. And when I first heard about this concept, I thought it was one of the more intriguing ideas out there. The areas I work in tend to focus on how we can drive corporate behavior to reduce carbon emissions, even absent government leadership. And one of the ways that might happen is if this concept actually has some real traction. But like any new concept, it needs to be tested. And so what we've done today, I think, is put together maybe the first panel on the way this would apply, particularly to climate mitigation, with a group that ranges from some people who are first beginning to formulate the idea as it relates to climate mitigation and environmental protection, to people who may be more positive, people who may be more skeptical, all the way through to someone who has an organization that is basically trying to take some of these concepts and push them into perhaps even a new form of governance altogether. So I think it's a really exciting time to be here. The idea today is for us to have a free-ranging discussion, not to have a whole series of particularly formal presentations, but we'll start with our panelists giving a few minutes of a presentation, and then we'll have a back and forth among us. We'll pass the microphone, as I mentioned, so that people on the webinar can hear as well. So let me first begin by introducing the panel and thanking Victoria, who's here, who's done tremendous work on this, as well as Jake, who's up here, and Robert. Thank you guys so much. It's very impressive. Immediately to my left is Madison Condon. Madison is Policy Integrity's current legal fellow. She, prior to joining NYU, where she is now, she was a fellow with the Earth Institute at Columbia University. She focused on environmental risk and disclosure there. She's clerk for Judge Jane Kelly of the 8th Circuit, served as a water security fellow, and has consulted with the OECD on carbon regulation and international trade law. She received her JD from Harvard, her MA from Tufts, and a BS in Earth and Environmental Engineering from Columbia. She's also been a Fulbright fellow to the Netherlands. And so that's Madison. Madison is also, from my perspective, one of the most sought after of the people out on the academic job hiring market right now. So she's been traveling around quite a bit talking about this specific paper. Next on our program will be Yesha, Yadav, who's down at our end here. She's a professor of law and a Chancellor faculty fellow here at Vanderbilt. She's also the faculty co-director of the LL.M program here. She has research interests in the area of financial securities regulation, particularly with the evolving response of regulatory policy to innovations in financial engineering, market microstructure, and globalization. Relevant to our discussion today, she's, before joining Vanderbilt, she was working as legal counsel with the World Bank and its finance, private sector development and infrastructure unit. Before joining the World Bank in 2009, she practiced in the London and Paris offices of Clifford Chance. She has, I won't go through all the degrees and so forth, we'll save time for our actual program. After Yesha will be Rick Alexander. Rick is a Georgetown grad. He practiced for 26 years at Morris Nichols, where he spent the last 4 years, or at least 4 of those years, as managing partner. He's been selected as one of the 10 most highly regarded corporate governance lawyers worldwide, as Delaware M&A Lawyer of the Year, Delaware Corporate Lawyer of the Year, one of the 500 leading lawyers in the United States as well. Important, again, for our program here, in 2015, he became the head of legal policy at VLab, something he can talk a little bit more about. And he's working on a fascinating new initiative right now that he can dive into during his program. After Rick, we're then going to go to Margaret Blair. Margaret is the Milton Underwood Chair in Free Enterprise here at Vanderbilt. She's an economist who focuses on corporate law and finance, including team production, the role of corporate boards of directors, legal concept of personhood, historical treatment of corporations by the Supreme Court, role of private sector governance arrangements and contract enforcement, and the problem of excessive leverage in financial markets. She's been on our faculty here since 2004. and is part of the team that supports the law and business program here at Vanderbilt. We then move to Mark Cohen. Well, actually, let's do Dorothy Lund next. Dorothy, I don't have your impressive bio in front of me, and I apologize for that. Here we go. Yes, I do. So Dorothy's on the phone from Southern Cal. Dorothy Gallier, can you check in?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great, fantastic. Dorothy is assistant professor of law at the University of Southern California. She is focusing her scholarship and teaching in the areas of corporate law, corporate governance, securities regulation, contracts, and mergers and acquisitions. Her research has appeared in, or is now forthcoming, in the Stanford Law Review, the Columbia Law Review, the Journal of Corporation Law, Delaware Journal of Corporation Law, and Stanford Journal of Law, Business and Finance. She got a BA from Pomona, JD from Harvard, was an Olin Fellow, clerk for Leo Strine, and Judge Flom on the U.S. Second Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. She's also practiced corporate law at Sullivan and Cromwell as well. And we're going to leave to last Mark Cohen down at the end there, my sometime co-author, co-teacher of a class we have here, The Law and Business of Climate Change. Mark is the Justin Potter Professor of American Competitive Enterprise and Professor of Law here at Vanderbilt. He's also a university fellow and former head of the research program at Resources for the Future as well. So with that, we'll start off with an initial discussion of the concept of the universal owner, starting with Madison.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about today's panel. So in recent decades, equity control has consolidated in a pretty small number of institutional investors who, because of modern portfolio theory, are pretty broadly diversified across the entire company, across the entire economy. So the same shareholders that own BP, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, also own very significant stakes in PepsiCo and General Mills and any public company that you can name that is severely exposed to the damages, the economic damages of climate change. And those damages to a portfolio are projected to be in the single-digit to double-digit trillions by 2100, and damages are mounting even in the near future. So in the past year, many multinational companies have announced pretty significant commitments to reducing their emissions, not only from their own operations, but from the sales of its products. Shell has committed to reducing emissions 20% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. Glencore, which is a giant mining company, has pledged to stop investing in coal. BP has pledged to conform its business plan to meeting the targets of the Paris Agreement, which is to keep warming below 2 degrees. And each of these commitments were made in direct response to coordinated shareholder pressure. Often, and this is notable, over objection from the boards of the companies and from the management of these companies. The CEOs make some sort of statement saying, like, this is not what's good for our company, coal is going to be great for the future, the best thing to do is keep investing. And then after a series of pretty targeted meetings with these diversified shareholders, an about face happens and the company changes its mind and makes pretty big commitments to emissions reduction. And increasingly, companies are actually, or investors are being pretty transparent about their motivation for undertaking these interactions with CEOs and management. And they're being very explicit that they expect climate change to severely damage their portfolio holdings in the future. And they're aware that the source of these damages come from companies that they themselves own. So not only are they trying to avoid the risk of climate damages to their portfolio, so labor will be less productive, storms will be more frequent and more severe, supply chains will be disrupted, agriculture will be disrupted. All these are real costs. But in addition to this, when you diversify across the economy, you become disinterested in idiosyncratic firm-specific risks because you're diversified. You are exposed to systemic risks that are economy-wide and can't be diversified away. And climate change is so far-reaching and touches every single aspect of the economy that it counts as a systemic risk. And so if you're a diversified investor and you're generating risk from this type of risk from within your own portfolio and you have control over the generation of this risk, you may in fact have a duty to do something about mitigating it. And increasingly, Even just recently in Time magazine, the head of the Japanese pension fund said, we are targeting fossil fuel companies because climate change poses a systemic risk to our portfolio and it's negative economic externality. And that's pretty clear that their motivation comes from their portfolio perspective. They're pressuring individual companies within their portfolio to change their behavior for the benefit of the broader portfolio, which is a pretty big deal and is in contrast with our traditional model of how shareholders behave to maximize individual corporate shareholder value. So it's called into a question a lot of conclusions, I think, about corporate governance and what its goals should be and how the law should respond to shape shareholder incentives. And I'm interested in hearing what my fellow panelists have to say about that.
Great. Let's go to Yesha.
Do you have slides?
Yes. Would you pass that?
Okay, so thank you so much to Mike for putting this event together and to Victoria for making it all happen. It's very heartening to have Mike on the forefront of trying to fight climate change, and what he's done here is actually created and contributed, I think, to intellectual climate change by bringing us all together and breaking down silos and getting us to have these really cool interdisciplinary conversations. So based on what Madison was saying, I'm not going to risk what little dignity I have as a banking scholar here to talk about climate change, but what I do want to do is highlight the role of common owners of these big asset managers, the Vanguards, BlackRock, State Street, as critical shock absorbers in today's financial markets. So as we all know from 2008, our biggest banks experienced enormous catastrophic failures in the financial crisis, having taken on far bigger risk than they could possibly pay off, right? So they took on far greater risk than they could possibly deal with by consuming these incredibly toxic securities, resulting in them incurring large costs they could not pay for, as a result of which the taxpayer had to foot the bill. So the logical response from the policymaker side has been to require banks following the crisis to make their balance sheets much stronger, right? To make their balance sheets much more robust in order to help them pay for the risk that they take on, and crucially, right, to help them fail in an orderly way so that they don't imperil the rest of the financial system. Right, and a key part of this design, right, to make these balance sheets much more robust is to require these banks to go out into the stock market and to raise funds much more fully by issuing equity, right? That is capital that is available to them freely that they can use, right? So they're required now to go into the market and raise equity and maintain a store of value from this equity capital, right? That they must keep in order to help pay for this rainy day and ensure that the shareholders, the value that they provide is available to them in case they cause large risk taking once again. So the short sort of takeaway here is that bank shareholders today are on the line to be wiped out in order to maintain the public good. The value that bank shareholders provide is, under regulatory design, required to be made available to pay for bank risk taking. Shareholders' interests should be equal to zero in the event that bank risk taking becomes too large, such that bank shareholders now are on the forefront as shock absorbers in the financial system. So one question that I've had in my research is really trying to understand who in their right mind would want to become a bank shareholder, right? Why would you want to go into this market, put your hard-earned money on the line to buy shares in banks, knowing that you could be wiped out in the interest of the public good? And then looking at the actual shareholding of the biggest banks, the biggest, most systemic banks in the US, specifically who the biggest shareholders are, those owning 5% or more of the common equity, a very interesting picture emerged that has changed quite dramatically from 2010 until 2017. Right, so surveying the sort of 24 or 25 biggest banks in 2010, there were very few of them that actually had big block holders. And the biggest asset managers, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, had only a handful of block shares, right? Ownership of 5% or more of the common equity, right? Vanguard had only one block ownership In 2010, BlackRock 10, State Street had just 1. Now, this picture has changed a great deal since Dodd-Frank was implemented, and banks are required now to go ahead and raise much more equity. This picture has changed dramatically. So today, BlackRock and Vanguard are block holders, owners of 5% or more equity at the 25 of the biggest 26 banks, right? State Street at number 12 has 12 big block holding shares. And what this essentially means is that BlackRock and Vanguard, the funds that they manage, have now enormous exposure to the default risk of the biggest banks in today's economic system, right? So the funds today are absorbing this enormous default risk, and bear in mind that financial risk tends to be correlated. Banks tend to fail together, right? So they're now exposed to this enormous risk in the marketplace. And the question is, what does this mean for them as stewards, corporate stewards, for the financial system? And I think the picture is quite mixed. On the one hand, right, because we're lawyers, we have to be pessimists, right? On the one hand, right, we can argue this is a terrible, terrible reality, right? These funds, which include savers like us, university endowments, all sorts, right, are exposed to this big financial risk. And in fact, bank shareholders tend to be, according to theory, very risk-seeking. They are baddies, right? They are the traditional baddies of the financial system because they are encouraging banks to take risks, knowing that the state often bails banks out, right? So the risk-taking here is subsidized. In addition, right, banks are incredibly complicated, right? Incredibly hard to value institutions. So because of these high costs, shareholders tend to be lazy, tend not to bother. It's very difficult to do this kind of work, and so they tend to give up easily, right? But I would argue and sort of close my comments with a more optimistic picture, right? That in fact, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street are maybe some of the best shareholders we could have, right, to be stewards in financial risk taking in today's marketplace. And the reason here is one, right, that these guys are not managing their own money, right? They're managing someone else's money, ours, right? They're not managing, you know, their own capital that might encourage them to be super risk-seeking. They're managing our money, right? They don't have that much incentive to be super risk-taking and risk-seeking in this context. In addition, their managers are being paid flat fees, right? Not performance-based fees. Unlike hedge funds who have hedge fund managers with their sort of racy, exciting lives, these money managers tend to have a far more boring existence, right? They tend to get paid flat fees, and so arguably the incentive to take big risks might not exist in the same way. In addition, the information that they do invest in getting, they can use to exercise oversight across the 26 banks that they're all invested in, right? And this is really helpful for us, I think, as from a policy perspective, because they can provide systemic private oversight of the marketplace as a backstop to the public oversight that we already have. So I think that this universal owner concept that we're looking into can be very useful for the financial system if we can create incentives and tools and levers to help BlackRock, State Street, and others to exercise good governance to protect their fund holders from being wiped out in another financial crisis.
Hey, Rick is next.
Thank you. Is that working? Okay, there it is. Well, that was a great presentation, and it actually makes me realize how, like, there's a significance to what we're talking about that's kind of maybe not immediately obvious, but the idea, if you think about the financial crisis and corporate law and how we talked about it 10 years ago, we talked about companies and staggered boards and their fiduciary duties, and we really looked at each company and sort of analyzed how it contributed to the financial crisis. And you just sort of described a completely different way of thinking about the equities market and how they relate to our financial system. And that's really what we're talking about, is a sea change in how we think about things. And the analogy that comes to mind is like in the 70s, you know, before the 70s, everyone thought about evolution where it was like individual, you know, beings were the mode of evolution. And, you know, that changed. And there was a book that Richard Dawkins wrote called The Selfish Gene. He said, no, it's actually the genes that are They're what's evolving. They're the things that are selfish and that have needs and that change. And this is the same kind of change, because what we're talking about doing is no longer thinking about individual companies as the creators of value. We're saying that there's systems that they participate in, and it's those systems. You're talking about the financial system, but it's also our environmental system and all ecosystem services that we get out of that. It's these systems that create value. And if you're an investor in equity, you're not just an investor in a company, you're an investor in the system. And that's really a completely different way of thinking about it. And I would suggest that it's sort of easy in some sense to sort of have this discussion we're having, but what's hard is then when you go back to work and you're in a system that's completely designed around companies being the unit of value creation. And so you have a mismatch in the way our policies work and in the way people think, the way investors think. And I'm gonna run through a few of my slides, but I think some of them Madison will talk to already. But I want to make the point here. So, there's a current movement right now, the ESG movement, environmental social governance. It's the sort of successor to the corporate social responsibility movement. It's this idea that probably most people listening or here are familiar with, that people are pressuring companies to be more responsible, to be more sustainable. But I would suggest that a lot of that movement continues to use an old way of thinking and continues to focus on companies. And that's a mistake. And sort of here's this universal owner slide that really goes through the ideas that Madison discussed, that the investors are mostly diversified. So what they're interested in is healthy systems, both for their portfolio to do well, also for their own lived experience, because what's the good of making a lot of money if you have to spend it on a hot, unequal planet? But here's the issue I think you come across is with the ESG movement, is that people encourage companies to be the unit of that environmental and social value creation, or hindering or stopping them from destroying that value. And I'm not sure that's always going to work. So we encourage companies to have climate competent directors and to make disclosures about their carbon footprint and their human capital policies, with the idea that if these companies get more focused on these things, the individual company will do better because it will be more efficient with respect to fuel use. It will get in front of regulation. It will have a happier workforce and more satisfied customers if it cares about these stakeholders. And that's great to a degree, but at some point, I think this is the crucial point to recognize, the interest of the company as the financial generator and the interest of the systems aren't going to agree. And what's interesting is, a month or so ago, the Business Roundtable made a big splash by coming out and saying, we're redefining the purpose of business. The purpose of business is no longer to make money, it's to serve all of its stakeholders. It's funny that the CEOs just thought they could declare that, but the CEOs, they're pretty powerful. And there's obviously a lot of op-eds were written, and some people said, oh, this is the greatest thing ever. Others said, well, I thought that's what business already did. I think that's what Margaret would have said. That's what business was, or should be doing it anyway. That's what business should have been doing all along. And some people said this is the end of capitalism as we know it. But after all those op-eds came out, the BRT, Business Roundtable, put out a set of FAQs. And number 6 was, what happens when the interests of stakeholders and shareholders diverge? And their answer was, in the long run, they never do. So we know that's just not true. It's sort of basic economics, that you can create profit through through exploiting negative externalities and inequalities. And so the point, I think, of sort of where Madison is coming from is that the companies are not going to be the best. While it's important to have companies understand these things, they're not going to be the best units to create this value. You're going to need you're going to need shareholders to think about it who have these universal owner characteristics. One question that comes up, I think, in this is, wait a second, what you're talking about is what government's supposed to do. Isn't the idea, I read my Milton Friedman, he said, the social purpose of companies is to create profits. And he didn't just say they should be rapacious, because he said to create profits within the law. And the idea there, and I think I heard somebody say this recently, that at the time Milton Friedman wrote that, the government was actually trying to address civil rights issues. They were passing civil rights laws. They were passing, creating the EPA and creating the Clean Air, Clean Water Act. They were actually doing the things that might have cabined in profit making, so that profit making did roughly equal societal value. But I think we all know, or many of us would agree, that the government isn't doing that these days. And it might not just be because the government isn't good at what it does. It might be that they're just sort of institutional barriers. In the financial crisis, some people might say government just can't keep up with the speed of the developments of sort of derivative technology. So it's often the case that government, for whatever reason, is unable to keep up with it. And so the idea might be, and this is the idea of the organization that I'm trying to start, is to establish guardrails that shareholders, universal shareholders, can implement. Some ways they're almost replacing regulation, where they can say, look, before you start thinking about profits, board and management, you need to, hew to a 1.5 degree science-based target, or you need, for carbon concentration, you need to certify to a certain level of living wage up and down your supply chain. Pick your societal value creation issue, but that's a way to address the fact that government is failing and that companies aren't the right unit, perhaps, for societal value creation. These are just some ideas that different things you might do. And one thing to think about is we often talk about compensation for executives. Well, why should it? And a lot of the talk currently is we need to create more connection between shareholder value and executive compensation. I want to suggest that connection without some guardrail is problematic, because you might be able to create a lot of value even in the long term by making sure, if you're an oil and gas company, that you get as much of your reserves out of the ground as you can, without regard to how much methane and carbon you're putting into the atmosphere in doing so. And so, one guardrail I would suggest is you don't get any of your compensation unless you meet the guardrails. And that way, we know you're making profits from actually creating value, not from exploiting negative externalities. And just to prove that we didn't just make this up, this is a report from 8 years ago, United Nations report, actually saying that universal shareholders need to be worried about these issues in order to protect the environment. Interesting bookend, yesterday there was an editorial in the Financial Times saying shareholders need to, or companies need to start thinking about what their universal investors need. And so just to sort of wrap up, I would say that the thing to keep in mind, and this is backwards because I'm just developing these slides, is the issues that shareholders really need to be thinking about first are the systemic issues. And systemic issues, by their nature, can only be addressed collectively, across the business spectrum. And that need for collective action requires pre-competitive, Mike doesn't like that word so much, pre-competitive standards that are in place before the companies start making competitive business decisions.
Fantastic. Margaret will go next, and then Dorothy, and then we'll wrap up with Mark.
Okay, since it's on now, it's on. Okay. So thank you, Mike, for putting this together. This is fun being up here, and it's really fascinating to hear from the people that are up here working on these ideas. I first encountered the idea of a universal owner almost probably 20 years ago. Jim Hawley and A.T. Williams, I don't know Williams, but I did talk to Hawley that long ago, wrote a book about this idea. And I think of the shareholder primacy movement as being like a freight train that was just moving through the corporate world at such a high rate, and academics were going along with it and supporting it, and the idea just got buried. And so it's a great idea. I'm really glad that it's being resurrected. There are a couple of issues about it that I would like to sort of lay out. I've not written about this myself, except sort of in the footnotes. I've alluded to it, and I talked about the difficulty of the various problems with shareholder primacy. The first is that when we think about who the universal owners are, one of the problems we have is that there are actually no more funds out there now than there are publicly traded companies. Okay, so that the universe of funds is huge, and some of them are more important than others. So we can look at the data that Madison put up on the screen for us a minute ago. We can see, well, there's Vanguard, and there's BlackRock, and there's Fidelity, and there's State Street. There's some that we really have to look at, and they're managing zillions of funds. But you don't, as an investor, you don't invest in BlackRock. You invest in one of their individual funds. So you're in the position as an investor to have to think about, well, which fund should I invest in? And right now, there's no way to sort of screen all of those funds to figure out, well, which one do I think is doing the best job of trying to push their portfolio companies to behave in the right way. And so we've got a tremendous problem that there's not one fund out there. My former co-author, Lynn Stout, who died about a year and a half ago, the last thing she did, literally on her deathbed, she helped to write a book, which is now called Citizen Capitalism, in which she proposes this. And she has this idea about there being sort of one big master fund. And I think the idea she was reaching for is similar to what we're talking about up here. I'm skeptical about that particular approach to getting there, but it's an incredibly important idea. But right now there are just so many different funds that we don't really, we can't talk about the universal owner as if there's only one fund. Secondly, is a huge problem, which I'm going to go back to Rick, just hope he can say more about later, and that is the problem of metrics. Suppose that at the level of the funds, they want to judge what's going on in individual companies in order to decide to invest in. We have no common metrics for measuring these kinds of things. Okay? And if you want to, if you're at the level of an individual investor and you want to decide what fund to put your money into, you're even more at sea. All you've got are the names of the funds. This is the social enterprise fund. This is the sustainable fund. What does that mean? You don't know what it means, and you don't know how to compare one to another. So the development of metrics for thinking about these problems ought to really, really be high priority. And the reason I say that, by taking this back to Rick, is that the B Labs have developed a set of protocols, and auditing protocols, and that they can go in and they come out with a certification. I don't know what those look like, and you can't find out what they look like. At least I couldn't easily without signing up to be audited. So you don't get access to what. So I'd like to know what's in those. What are the auditing standards and what is the auditing process, and how do we know that the people that are doing the auditing know what they're talking about and aren't themselves corrupt? So we've got a huge institutional problem to put in place the systems in order for this idea to really go forward and be carried out in practice, I think. And I'd like for all of us to begin thinking about those issues.
Excellent. So Dorothy, let's go ahead and have you click in from Los Angeles.
Okay, hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So thanks, Mike, so much for having me, and I'm really excited about the work that's being done in this area. In my own work, I've come at this issue from a slightly different angle, and I've been looking at how the rise of index investing is going to affect corporate governance. And my view is largely pessimistic, so I hope my comments will shed some light on the pitfalls and limitations of universal owner stewardship. So I agree that in theory, universal owners should have an incentive to take action to reduce externalities and systemic risk that's going to dampen the overall performance of the portfolio. But I think there are other incentives going on that are going to stand in the way of them accomplishing this. So, you know, the prototypical universal owner is an index fund. This is a fund that's seeking to track the performance of a baseline index like the S&P 500. And an index tracking strategy means that that fund is going to lack a financial incentive to invest in stewardship for two big reasons. So first, mutual funds compete on the basis of their relative performance and also on fees. So this leads to a collective action problem because any investment in stewardship that benefits the portfolio is also going to benefit all of my competitors. Well, only I, as the activist fund, is going to incur any cost. So as the index fund that is investing in stewardship is going to be guaranteed to harm its relative performance, and that provides a really strong incentive to free ride. So second, index funds, by virtue of this indexing strategy, lack firm-specific information that other investors have. So an automated trading strategy means that you, as the index fund portfolio manager, don't need to monitor any of the companies in that broad portfolio. So that means that the fund is going to have to incur additional expenses to, engage proactively in stewardship, or even evaluate shareholder proposals and governance interventions brought by other investors. And those expenses would cause the fund to have to charge a higher fee and would likely, alienate free-sensitive investors and drive them away. So I think passive funds have really strong incentives to free ride. And there's another incentive problem that I'm just going to mention briefly, although I think it's also something to think about. I've called this the corporate client conflict, and this is the conflict of interest that emerges because most index funds count on management as a source of 401k assets. So this provides a strong incentive to support management and not alienate this source of assets. So to make this all concrete, imagine a typical S&P 500 tracker fund that's considering whether to support a shareholder proposal that would urge Alcoa to reduce emissions by 20% by the year 2030. How is the index fund going to vote? So this index fund portfolio manager lacks firm-specific information about any of the companies in that portfolio, including Alcoa. And to understand whether supporting the proposal would likely benefit Alcoa or the broader portfolio, the index fund manager would need information that it doesn't have the resources to get. So supporting the proposal could also alienate Alcoa management, as well as the management teams of other companies in that industry who could take some action to punish the index fund by refusing to invest their 401k assets. So when faced with that choice, either spend resources to figure out the right answer and possibly face some blowback from your clients, or just reflexively vote no, what would you do? So I think that gives you a sense of the problem. In theory, there's some good incentives. Index funds should want to do good stuff, but they're profit maximizing institutions that are ultimately going to focus on their bottom line, which cautions against informed and engaged participation. And if we look at the big three, the so-called big three institutional investors that primarily invest in index funds, this is BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, we see some evidence that suggests that these incentives might be winning out. So these investors have been talking a big game about their interest in using their clout to serve society, to quote from Larry Fink's letter. But we don't see them backing this up with a lot of action. They never bring shareholder proposals. 90% of the time, they fail to support environmental proposals brought by others. And this is even true of the so-called green index funds. And they claim to be engaging with companies behind the scenes on these environmental issues. This is difficult to believe and impossible to verify. But even if that's true, that they're out there engaging behind the scenes, what's the threat? They're not ever voting no. They're not exiting. And public pension funds, who are clients of the big three, have been calling the big three out on their reluctance to act more proactively in the ESG areas. So, this may explain some of their efforts to convince everyone of their, sincere involvement. So this is not to say that all universal owners have bad incentive to invest in portfolio-wide stewardship. I'm just particularly skeptical of the big three and of index funds. And given their massive clout and importance, by some estimates, the big three now control approximately 25% of the votes of every S&P 500 company. Their failure to participate in an effective way could thwart the efforts of other investors with better incentives. And exactly, I agree with Margaret that there's also a capital deployment issue at work here. So if investors want their votes and their governance rights to be in the hands of someone who's going to use them well, and they think that they can invest in a BlackRock green index fund and get cheap diversification for a low fee, that's a problem. It means that they're missing out on the chance to put their money in the hands of people who are going to use those governance rights well to make a difference. So this is why I think we need to be really critical of the big three and their efforts, and hesitate before we congratulate them until we can be more sure that they're using their governance rights in the ways that their investors want and expect.
Great, Dorothy. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dorothy. We're going to turn now to Mark Cohen, and then we'll try to have a discussion among the members of the panel. I think your points provoked a couple of different people on the panel to say, "Oh, I'd like to respond to that." So we'll have a great discussion here in just a moment. Mark, you want to be the Jose Altuve of our group?
Sure. Well, thank you, Mike. This is very interesting panel and very interesting discussion. I guess maybe I'm the oldest one in the room. Margaret said she first heard about this 20-some years ago. I actually thought about this even longer. There was actually a paper, Roger Gordon, and the paper that I was the special editor for a journal, Managerial Decision Economics, ended up being published in 1997, I think, 6 or 7. So I was soliciting papers around 95, 96 timeframe. And one of the ones that I selected, and I really liked it, is a paper by John Harford, an environmental economist. And he basically made the same point. He said that once you start to have sort of differentiated owners and you have a diversified portfolio, then all of a sudden the steel plant's emissions are affecting your what else you own, and he was making that really interesting point. And so it's been published, but I think the reason it really hasn't taken hold is partly because these diversified portfolios were so small. It's not in the 90s, early 90s. It's not what it is today. And so we've seen that. So times have changed. But coming back to sort of what the question is, sort of from an economic standpoint, and I'm an economist, but from an economic standpoint, if you think about a closed economy, then if you have a diversified portfolio, then there are no externalities. All those externalities are affecting you. But now we think about, well, how can we make this argument? And does this really stand? Does it really hold? And I think Dorothy actually made some really interesting points on an internal level, sort of internal to the decision makers of these diversified portfolios, which I wasn't going to address, but I think are really relevant. So I agree with those concerns. Now I want to step back and sort of make some larger, more macro problems. So start to think about well, first of all, I want to say that even if this is all workable, it's only one piece of the puzzle, right? You can't necessarily rely upon it, but so that's fine, because you're never going to solve climate problem with one fell swoop anyway. So if it has an impact, great. So let's not worry about that. But I do want to ask, as any economist would, what are the unintended consequences? So let's start to think about it. Again, I'm very supportive of the idea. In fact, I talk about this in my classes over at business school. These are things that we actually talk about as diversified portfolio and those kind of things. So So I don't want to dismiss it at all, but we need to put some ground, a little bit of ground truth. So the first thing I think of is the sin stocks, right? When you have these in theory, socially responsible investment funds selling off sin stocks and depressing their price, what happens? People who aren't so socially responsible buy up those things and actually make good money. There's actually evidence that sin stocks are quite profitable. Maybe that's just a war story.
It should be on a risk adjusted basis.
That's fine, whatever. But the point is that one of the points is that somebody else is going to buy it, right? Is one question. So because again, the question then is it really a closed economy? But now I think more important than that, that's just sort of the idea behind it. Let's start to think about what we're talking about. We're talking about a small set of the universe of publicly traded companies. First of all, we all know that publicly traded companies are going down, right? Private equity has been going up. And so the extent to which this matters now, so the first is, well, then the next, but it's still one slice, right? But that's a static view. So my question is, are there going to be unintended consequences such as if you're a publicly traded company and you're a fossil fuel company and you're getting targeted with all these investors saying you should divest, you should do this, just buy the damn stock, just go private and pollute away. So I think that's one of the potential unintended consequences of this concept, which is that there's going to be pressure to get out of that closed system. The bottom line is it's not really a closed system, closed economy. And it's not just private equity markets. It's what about state-owned enterprises? What about public lands? I mean, so there's a lot of carbon, emitting, greenhouse gas emitting sources that are well outside of this closed economy. And so, again, part of it is saying, well, okay, you can only solve a piece of the puzzle. But what I want to raise is the question about, are there these unintended consequences to push some parts of the dirty economy outside of what otherwise you think is going to actually start to regulate them, if you will, instead actually give them a worse situation down the road. So it's something we got to be careful of in thinking about design this.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. That's really thoughtful. I just gave a paper with Jonathan Gilligan on Friday at a symposium where we talk about private equity. Something fascinating is going on. We called it the new revolving door. And what you're beginning to see is, rather than the traditional revolving door, people move from corporations and the government and back and forth, and concerns about whether that then steers government toward a corporate perspective. What we're beginning to see more and more is people who are NGO staffers moving into private equity firms. So the Carlyle Group has a chief sustainability officer who's a former head of the Environmental Defense Fund. KKR has a former EDF staffer there as well. BlackRock has a similar kind of thing. So that's a fascinating new revolving door, which is emerging as all these issues get more complicated. So I know you all have a variety of things. I want to kick off with two quick things. I know Madison has a response she wants to do to Dorothy, and we should engage in that. But I first want, if I could, go to Rick, because as I heard Dorothy talking about this really powerful point about essentially index funds trying to keep their transaction costs down. That's an advantage. I wondered whether what you're really talking about is a simple mechanism for them to do that, so that they could get essentially the equivalent of a B Corp certification, except it would be your guardrail certification, so that an index fund would simply have to articulate, we'll include in our index fund all those firms that have X certification or something like that. Is that what you're doing? And then let me just follow that up with, if it is, that then raises a question that many of us in this area wrestle with, which is, what's the accountability process, the democratic process by which those guardrails that you're proposing get started? Why is that better than the currently flawed governmental process? And audited. Okay, so that's a quick and easy one.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that the vision, for what we're doing at the Shareholder Commons does not involve security selection. So it would not be picking the good stocks and getting rid of the bad stocks, because that's just squeezing the balloon and go somewhere else. It's an engagement theory. It is a theory of saying in order for companies to actually be creating value in the world, they need to not be contributing to carbon concentration, beyond their fair share of a 1.5 degree world. And again, I think the way to get there isn't through through metrics and disclosure. I mean, obviously that's part of it. It's actually through performance. And I think, it's just, this is a matter of doing the hard work that people are doing. I think I saw somewhere that 38 public companies had agreed to go to SBTI and to get verifiable 1.5 degree targets and to start hewing to them. So that's the kind of concept. It's getting some sort of measurable, verifiable, universalifiable standards and trying to apply them to everybody. And just to Mark's point about, well, aren't people just going to leave the public markets? The limited partners of hedge funds, private equity funds, venture capital funds are also universal owners. They're hedge funds. They're pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and endowments. And so it's the same people. And so the idea would be to influence those. And I won't let people in, but I think there's examples of these things having been done successfully in the past.
Can I just push you for a moment on the democracy side of that? So why aren't these just the Rick Alexander standards? How do we know that they better reflect public preferences or whatever set of standards? How do you decide whether equity is a piece of it or not a piece of it, or climate, or misuse of pharmaceuticals? How do you what's the process by which those standards get developed so that they somehow stand in for what government?
I think they're definitely not going to be the Rick Alexander standards. The idea here is that there are already actors in the ESG world pushing, certain types of disclosure, pushing, certain types of targets. And the idea is to work with the current infrastructure and have them more focused on a universal investor, systemic sort of set of standards than they are now. Because right now, when you look at things like SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards, and the things that are being pushed as sort of the leading edge, all of those standards tie back to company financial performance materiality. So we're just looking to get a better approximation. I mean, this is not going to solve all problems. It's toward getting a better approximation of what we need to do.
Great. And I know, Madison, you had a thought on the mutual fund question that Dorothy was raising. Maybe you can respond.
Sure. So I guess I just want to be clear about what part of the argument is descriptive and which part is prescriptive, which part is normative and which part is positive, meaning how much are we describing what investors are already doing, and how much are we saying investors should be doing this. So the most active investor coalition right now is a group called Climate Action 100+. It has 360 institutional investors that controls a combined $35 trillion in assets, which is 40% of global GDP. And this group has been incredibly active. They were behind the Shell targets and the Glencore commitments and the BP commitments. HSBC is a member, CalPERS is a member, the Japanese pension fund is a member. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are not members. And I agree with Dorothy that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street have actually had a pretty terrible climate record. There's a few instances where they have stepped in and done something. They opposed 2 Exxon board members because Exxon refused to engage in climate oversight. But in general, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are not so active. You can still talk about a lot of money in the stock market that is controlled by universal owners and diversified investment companies without talking about the big three. So part of the question is, if you want investors to behave this way, why aren't the big three behaving this way? And do we have to change certain things about the law and fiduciary duty in order to make them behave this way? I think the thing that we haven't talked about so far is, many institutional investors' mandate is to simply maximize their big portfolio of assets. If you are a pension fund or an insurance company, your mandate is just to grow your assets. That's your mandate. If you're BlackRock, you have many underlying retail investors who opt into, as Margaret said, individual sub-funds. So Margaret could decide to invest in the S&P 500 index fund that BlackRock owns or mandates, and I could choose to invest in an energy ETF, of which Exxon is 20% of the value. And and BlackRock owes a duty to both me and Margaret, because we're both BlackRock's clients. So if BlackRock votes to maximize its total portfolio of assets, it might be doing the best, it might be voting in the best interest of Margaret, but it's probably sacrificing my investments in order to maximize BlackRock's total portfolio investments. And this is a problem, I think, and it might be part of the reason why the big three has been less involved in the climate action space as other companies who are structured differently.
Dorothy, did you want to respond to that before we go down the panel here?
Yeah, just quickly, I'll say I completely agree. You know, I think that there's a lot of money out there that's doing better than them. But you know, why I think it is important to focus on them is, you know, without the support of the big three, you're not going to get very far. I think, you know, like I said, they control 25% of the vote now, and that's predicted to go up to 40% in the next 10 years. So I think a really important part of this is exactly what Madison said. How do we think about making them behave better? And I think this in my mind, you know, I thought about this a lot, and I don't think I know the answer, but I think part of the problem is exactly what Margaret said, is that there's this complete lack of transparency in all of this. You know, Larry Fink can go out there and say, actually, sorry, it wasn't Larry Fink, it was Bill McNabe says, you know, we're better than actively managed mutual funds. We're more engaged. We're better at ESG than anybody else out there. And you as an investor have no way to evaluate those claims, right? So I go out there and I'm reading their glossy marketing materials, and I'm seeing, wow, BlackRock engaged with, you know, 200 companies last year on environmental issues. That, you know, that doesn't mention that that's only, you know, 2% of their portfolio, and it doesn't explain what's an engagement. Is Larry Fink's letter to all CEOs, does that count as an engagement? Does a phone call count as an engagement? How are investors able to know, oh, okay, so Larry Fink tells me that he's going to change the world, and I'm also going to get, you know, an index fund that only charges me 2 basis points. Well, hey, I'm going to put my money there. So I think something needs to change, or maybe a good place to start in thinking about reform is how do we make all this way more transparent, and so we can critically evaluate what these big players are doing, and they can't get away with making some of these claims that they're making.
Yes, you know, one of the interesting things that, from my experience in private practice, is it's often the very powerful but non-transparent connections. It's the phone call from the key internal investor to the CFO that might make a difference, and yet that would never show up on our radar screen. Those of us who do empirical work in this area, we wouldn't see a reported decision on that. We wouldn't see a shareholder resolution, and yet it might be quite powerful. But the point you're raising, if I understand it correctly, is that if we can't assess it, then we have a hard time knowing when it's occurring and how to encourage it and how to evaluate companies based on that. Margaret, did you have a comment or Mark does?
Just one quick follow-up to that point, and again, it's not the only solution, but there are organizations that are trying to develop. I mean, there's lots of information out there on carbon from CDP and from others that on sort of what the carbon emissions are, what the footprint is of different organizations, and one can then develop. Here's what the impact of my portfolio is. And so you can do the same thing with BlackRock. I don't think they've done that yet, Vandenbergh, but it's certainly doable. It's an approximation. So to the extent to which consumers care about it, that's again another market mechanism, and you can say, well, you know, I want to go to this fund because they actually have. Now, you're quite right that some of their fund may be fossil fuels, and some of their clients may pick fossil fuels. The extent to which that really matters to consumers, then they can stay away from the asset owners, you know, the big controllers, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, who have those funds. Anyways, that's one potential check on the system.
Margaret.
Yeah, so this is Margaret. Is it on there?
Yeah.
Okay, so the issue here is of metrics, and how we measure it is just huge, and there's no way we can get around it. Now, the climate change question, there is one metric that's really important, and that's carbon emissions. And so I can see a possibility of some of this working, although we don't have we have to take the company's word for it when they tell you what their carbon emissions are and what they were last year. And did they get their carbon emissions to go down because they sold off their dirty properties to somebody else who's still emitting those carbons? There's a lot more to know than just carbon emissions, but at least it's one metric. When you get off into other kinds of social responsibility issues, the mechanisms of figuring it out are just all over the map, and the kinds of things you want people to be interested in. I've been working for the last 16 or 17 years with an organization that's has been trying to work on worker health and safety and protections in certain kinds of factories and around the globe. And it took 8 or 10 years before we really had a workable, auditable protocol to be able to walk in the factory and figure out what was going on in here. And even then, we're not convinced we're catching everything. And so these issues are huge, and they've taken a massive amount of people walking around in factories to try to figure out how to do this sort of thing. So I think my inclination is to focus on is to start focusing on developing metrics and get people to publish what the metrics are and how they're using them. That would be a start.
And on the carbon front, there are well accepted protocols for measuring carbon. CDP claims to have $100 trillion under management. We've talked about what can that mean if that's 3 times global GDP, but investors worth $100 trillion if CDP is reporting correctly are reporting already to CDP or are demanding reports from companies and through a whole series of metrics. So we have a pretty good system out there, and then many countries have formal legal governmental requirements about how to report and how much to report. So I can imagine possibly, maybe this is just because this is my area, but putting it back to Rick, if one of the problems here is how do we avoid very difficult problems? Liberals and conservatives have deeply different views of what justice and equality means. If we run into that, maybe a first step is to focus on something that's easily verifiable and to focus it on something like carbon and build out a system that way, and then think, if that succeeds, about a broader set of criteria or guardrails. Rick?
Yeah, I do very much think that this proceeds not with like a grand design to conquer the world, but sort of one standard at a time, working, building relationships with funds and I want to, one point I want to make is, there is historical precedent for this. So when I started practicing law in the 1980s, every company on the S&P 500 virtually had a staggered board and plurality voting and a poison pill. They had these very strong anti-takeover protections. And I remember seeing, like in the mid-90s, these shareholder proposals to like de-stagger the board or like put in majority voting. And we just kind of like smiled and said, that's cute. They're active, and it would come from William Steininger, and just thought he was this kind of cranky guy who sent in proposals. But guess what? Through the action, mostly I would say probably that the real action was with public pension funds and private Taft-Hartley funds. All the boards are now de-staggered, and all the voting is now majority, and poison pills don't exist except when there's like a hostile takeover. So I think there really is precedent. So I would say there is precedent for people winning over the free rider issue, and I also think then thinking about, well, what place might you start? You're suggesting climate metrics. I would suggest starting perhaps with political spending, because political spending is, when you go back to the slide about why isn't government working, I think some of us think that might be a large part of it. And there are Bruce Freed, for example, is a very active shareholder activist, working with shareholders to try to force companies to either disclose or reduce the political spending. One idea out there is no political spending, no lobbying, no paying money to trade groups unless you've gotten your shareholders to approve it, which would make a big difference. So I think there are areas to move forward. I do think it has to be done.
Let me see.
Mike, can I jump in?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good point, and thinking about how, you know, the success, what's a way that you could imagine change happening in all the things that you mentioned, you know, de-staggering boards, removing poison pill. These are all things that could be done easily at scale, right? You know, you have a company that can say, I'm going to adopt a policy and I'm going to apply it across the entire portfolio and achieve some benefits in that way. And I think this is where, in the very limited instances where you've seen the big three be proactive, you know, board diversity is an example, or I think they've actually been quite good. You have State Street setting a policy that they'd like to increase the diversity of boards, and they're going to vote against nominating directors of all female boards. And then again, you know, they're relying on that economy of scope to really improve, you know, one metric across the portfolio. So I think these are instances where you can make a change across the portfolio where we can imagine them being really good. It's trickier when you have things that don't lend themselves to scope, that, you know, you require firm-specific information, really technical questions that are going to have, it's going to be, the right answer will vary from firm to firm.
Right. And let me ask now, we haven't asked if we have any questions out in the audience. Is anyone here? Brenda, I'm going to bring you the microphone so that people have the worldwide audience can hear.
Thanks. So this has been very interesting. I just wondered, since we have such a dysfunctional government that can't really do anything, are there countries out there that have much more functional governments where this type of activism is more successful than it is here in the U.S., or are we the only example of where people are pushing at a private level to try and bring about change?
I think there's different levels of, you know, clearly people think, I think there's a view that the EU is ahead of us, and people often, you know, point to, you know, Germany and their sort of co-determination on boards as being more advanced corporate governance, and some of the work they're doing on the environment governmentally is being more advanced. On the other hand, Volkswagen is a German company. So, you know, I think, you know, one of the issues you have with systemic concerns is the balloon squeezing, and I think that includes geography. I think that if you fix a problem in Europe, then it can pop up in the US, and if you fix it in the US, it can pop up in Asia. And an advantage of this idea is that capital markets are fairly globalized at this point. I mean, we still have state-owned enterprises, so we're not going to fix that this way. But I think to some extent there's dysfunction around the world because of the fractionalized, you know, nature of 150 nations around the world, and this is one way to try to address that.
Just for what it's worth, we've in the work we've done talked quite a bit about the power of supply chain contracting that way as well. Walmart is committed to get a gigaton, which is 1 billion tons of carbon emissions reductions. That's like Germany going carbon neutral for a year. They have more than 60,000 suppliers around the world. I think would be the 6th largest trading partner with China if they were a sovereign nation. So when they say we're going to reduce a gigaton of carbon emissions, it actually has global effects without regard to what the international law process is like. So Margaret, and then I think Kevin has a question.
Yeah, so I think the issue of whether government's working or not is huge, and one of, I don't know whether other countries are necessarily doing a better job, but one of my reactions when I hear people say, you know, leave the private sector to maximize share value, that's their job. Government set the rules of the game, that's their job, is that our government's not working. And big corporations are an important societal institution that is working pretty well. I mean, it's working to do what they've been told historically they were supposed to do. Now, and they're also working internationally, and they work across, since they work across the globe, they don't have they don't necessarily have the political constraints. And so I think there's possibility there, but getting them to take responsibility it may be a bridge too far. I don't know.
Okay. Great, thanks so much. This was a fabulous panel. I guess two questions really. One's about scope and one's about mechanisms. The scope idea is, I sort of understand how if you own, maybe just in the climate change context, if you own companies that will be imperiled by increased climate risk, but that you own both of them, that you have an interest in advocating those externalities will become internalities, internal costs for you. My scope question is, how many other environmental or other problems are of that nature? Which is this sort of uniquely perfect for climate, or I don't know enough about toxics or enough about other kinds of external harms that we might think. And it does just deal with external harms. It presumably doesn't deal with distributional questions. And I guess then the second question is, even if you were owners of all those things, what's the, this is where I need to know more corporate law, right? What's the mechanism? Do you have to be individually advocating for each board to make different kinds of choices, or do you just simply divest? I don't know exactly. So anyway, there's a couple questions. I think largely to Madison, but I'm happy to have anyone else jump in.
So I think, so there are 224 fossil fuel companies in the world that are responsible, that are the originators of all fossil fuels. And those include state-owned companies and private companies and publicly traded companies. So of total industrial emissions, 30% come from publicly owned companies. And if Saudi Aramco actually goes public, which they claim to do, that number will jump significantly. That number is easy to find out. I mean, it's true that climate change is a unique example because it's generated from a pretty small number of companies, but where you emit, it goes up in the atmosphere and it warms the globe equally. And so the victim firms, companies, are distributed around the globe. Whereas if you're talking about toxic pollutants or pesticides or something that is more local, the harm is not distributed in the same way, and it's who's generator of the harm, who's the recipient of the harm is hard to identify. And so, I've done a pretty rough, but I think legitimate, I talked to climate scientists about it, cost-benefit analysis about the trade-offs between forcing fossil fuels to forego emissions and lose profit, and whether or not that lost profit is outweighed by mitigated damages using a climate model, and I find that it is. That math that I did is much, much harder to do if you're talking about employee education. In theory, if you own the whole economy, you will still invest more in your employees because if they leave to go to another firm, you don't care because you own that firm too, or maybe you. So one interesting place to look for this is in the literature on common ownership, which basically alleges that because many firms within an industry all share the same large shareholders, these industries behave less competitively because American Airlines, Delta, Southwest, etc., are all owned by the same 6 funds. And there's some empirical work on that, and that work is growing. But there's, in addition to internalizing negative externalities, there's the possibility that it could generate positive externalities. Like you might invest more in innovation because if someone steals your idea, you actually own the person who stole the idea, so you're happy for there to be positive spillovers between companies. And there's some empirical work suggesting that this does in fact happen, that the more common ownership actually does directly relate to more innovation. In terms of the mechanism, I think it's important to be clear, it's explicitly not divestment. It's a lot of different other types of things, but if you sell the company, then you lose the ability to tell the CEO what to do. So a lot of these investors have explicitly said, we are not going to divest because we think it's better to make change through these meetings. So most of the mechanisms are behind closed doors. There's secret meetings, like Dorothy said, we don't know exactly what's said, but we do know that the CEO does a major about-face after these meetings occur. Some of them are pretty clear, like a direct linking of CEO compensation incentives to emissions reductions, or like 200 members of like the executive management team compensation directly linked to emissions reductions. Some are more public and transparent, like many investor coalitions have penned open letters and published them in the Financial Times saying, this is what we expect from every company we own. Here it is in the Financial Times. Now you're all on notice. So that's That's an example.
I just want to add one thing, which I think is important to keep in mind, is that we've been talking about as though all these externalities are going to be internalized in the case of climate, and that's not necessarily true at all. So we're talking about companies, right? Think about the impact of climate on elderly in heat waves. Okay, there may be huge deaths, increase in deaths, mortality, which has no negative consequence on profitability. In fact, they have a positive impact on it. Whatever. I mean, the point is that the impacts are not necessarily just isolated there. And the other point I want to make, though, is that there are winners and losers in these games. And so thinking about who's going to win from a corporate standpoint, it's innovative companies, startup companies, companies that are doing renewables now, but in the future. Think about the, geographically, who's going to actually gain from climate. The models suggest Canada, Russia, maybe Europe, Scandinavia, actually have net positive GDP, so businesses there are going to grow. So I do think it's much more complicated. It's not, again, not to say that we shouldn't be worrying about this. There's some really interesting ideas here, but I do think it's important to keep that in mind.
One way I think it's helpful to think about the universal personal ownership question is to think about it as a solution first. Don't think about the problem, because we're talking about, well, gee, this might solve the problem where some companies, where there's a negative sum game going on between companies. But then you could also say, well, what about, and that's your point, but it might also be that you externalize to individuals, but those individuals own companies, so their lived experience. But then again, you might also be externalizing to people who live on $1 a day in the Indian subcontinent, and they're not helped by any. This just matters to them as humans, not as owners of any portfolio at all. But what I would want to emphasize is, if you want to address any of those through company action, step number one would be to make the solution pre-competitive, so that everybody's competing on an even playing field. So that if we decide somehow as a society that we don't want people living in Bangladesh to have 5 million or 100 million people have to be climate refugees, and we can do something about it, that through business responsibility, that we need to give them an even playing field and not ask them to altruistically give up margin where their next company, their peer, isn't doing that. And so it's a solution that can answer a lot of different questions, I think, that may be negative sums between companies, but then they may be something else.
Yeah, so the solution that we're talking about here, it always takes longer.
It has a little delay.
It takes longer when I do it.
It's that electromagnetic
If the
field.
green light will come on.
Here,
Green
this
light.
is on. This is on. You can use this one.
Hello. Okay, so one of the things that this makes me think about is how if we're talking about using this solution, okay, we can reach publicly traded companies that way, and but we can't reach anyone else. And one of the things that some people in the world of finance and corporate law and corporate governance have started worrying about, or some people have, is that, well, there's decline in the number of publicly traded corporations. And it's down a lot from its peak in 1998 during the dot-com boom. It's not clear that if you sort of take out the dot-com bubble, that we're necessarily down where you might expect us to be if you just projected the trends prior to that. But nonetheless, there's a lot of business activity that's being moved into and carried out in closely held corporations, and those are not necessarily small. Because if you think about the Koch brothers, they're not affected by this. Okay, so it is still true that by some measures, the aggregate activity of the publicly traded sector represents about the same proportion of total economic activity as it has for the last 40 or 50 years. But I don't know that this privatization trend may not be over, and it could reach a point where we're really not what's going to happen is the people that are, the firms that are engaged in the dirty activity, they'll just go closely held and they will be reachable through this solution.
So our goal with the panel was to try to put the idea of universal owner on the table and then to beat it up a little bit, take a hard look at it. And I think our panelists have done an amazing job of doing that. So let's thank them.